JBM here, continuing my October 2012 horror movie marathon discussions, and this is a horror film that I ran into. There's been dozens of horror anthologies made, and you might have heard of Campfire Stories. That's the whack one that came out in like the early 2000s with like the girl that's from The Sopranos. Well, this one came out in 1997 and it's called Campfire Tales. And it's a dud. It's a dud for sure. It's low budget shows multiple times throughout the script, including these are the kids who tell the story. Well, not the ones on this poster, definitely not. The only thing that drew it to me is it has an interesting cast when you look back on it. Even though it had a good concept, it was at a time where Scream, Halloween H2O, Urban Legend. If this was picked up by a bigger studio, it could have been a dope movie that could have been remembered. But as you look back on it, it still had a lot of interesting people in the cast. Ron Livingston, Amy Smart, James Marsden, Christine Taylor, Malcolm in the Middle's older brother. I forget his name. He's in here. Anyway, it follows these four kids who are out joyriding sober as hell, and then they crash off screen. It's so sloppy edited. It's so badly edited that like they don't even show the crash. They just show the kids walking up like out of the ditch with like flashlights. Like, oh, you all ready? I'm not gonna go down and check you. Neither is the camera. But are you ready? They even Trauma movies had a budget big enough to wreck a car in like the Toxic Avenger. That's just strike one on the budget there. Then the stories that they tell are obviously pretty generic, kind of urban legend type of stories. The first one is Ron Livingston. It's a couple on a honeymoon out in an RV and they get attacked by a monster, but they don't even show what the monster is. All the stories are just a slow, it's like the writers, all they had in mind was the ending, is the shock ending. So everything in between is just nonsensical babbling from the characters that are in the new characters that they introduced for the different stories. Yeah, so the four kids that crashed, they start a bonfire because they're like, oh, we're out in the middle of nowhere, so we're just gonna start a bonfire because it's October and it's cold. And then they tell the stories, and that was the first one, the honeymoon couple. And the second one was kind of interesting for its time. It's about an internet predator who's stalking a 12-year-old girl and who ends up at her house, which is kind of cutting edge for the time. It was 1997. Well, I can remember in 1998, 99. That was like in 2000. That was like when I was in middle school. Everyone used to be on Instant Messenger, whether you were 12, and there was always that saying of don't talk to people that you don't. I remember I used to be in chat rooms talking to like 16-year-old girls when I was like 12, and I thought I was like the shit, or I thought they were old as hell and they were like 16. Even though it was probably like some 35-year-old pedo. And that's what it ends up being in this, and the pedo shows up. So that's kind of interesting. And then the final one's like some guy who's like totally 1990s out. He's on his bike and he's riding his bike. He's soul searching on a cross country trip. And he shows up at this girl's house who's like in the 1890s, stuck in the 1890s. And this is totally unrealistic. Oh yeah, you can't even buy into half the stories because the characters are just terrible, of course, and it's terribly written, terribly directed. And that ends up being a ghost story. Like, yeah, she's some mute, hot rich who lives by herself with her ghost father in the middle of nowhere. And then at the end, I'm not gonna spoil it, then there's like a twist with the main cast that you end up seeing. So if you're up for it, if you're into campfire stories, really bad 90s anthology films, or a fan of any of these actors I mentioned, that's the only way I'd recommend it. This is JBM, my horror movie marathon videos coming up October 2012, and I'm out.